everybody, Mike Griffith here. Welcome to tonight's Ingles on the Beat feature, and really pleased to bring on South Carolina beat writer Ben Portnoy. Ben works for the South Carolina State, and Ben, you've had an eyeful of Shane Beamer in these Gamecocks. The first couple games of the season, South Carolina 2-0, a very promising start for Coach Beamer. Some of your takeaways on South Carolina.
Yeah, it's been a good start. I mean, look, this is a team that's rebuilding, and Shane and everyone else have said they want to try and win now, and that's the goal. And so far South Carolina's done that. They beat Eastern Illinois. They escaped a tricky East Carolina team last week and at East Carolina. So it's been fun. It's been interesting. I think it's a team that has still has a ways to go, and I think we'll learn a lot more obviously this week against Georgia, but has been fun to watch so far, and it's been fun to watch sort of how Shane's attacking this sort of rebuild and this sort of reboot in Columbia.
Yeah, it was really knocked down, drag out win over East Carolina. Gamecocks playing from behind. One of the things I noticed when East Carolina was leading was Shane Beamer. And of course, people in Georgia are familiar with Coach Beamer. He was on Kirby's staff in 2016 and 2017, and then Shane went to Oklahoma with kind of padding his head coaching potential resume in mind, going to work for Lincoln Riley, and obviously it worked. But the thing I noticed, Ben, was he seemed very poised on the sideline. That's a bit of a departure from the more emotional style that I think we've been seeing previously from Will Muschamp there.
Yeah, that's it's a good observation, and I think that's the thing that's funny, that's interesting, I should say, is Shane's a pretty poised guy. He's pretty together. I talked to his I wrote a long feature about Shane a couple of weeks ago, and talked to his dad and every other head coach that he had worked for in the past, including Kirby, and everyone said, and Frank in particular said, the thing is, like, he could lean on Shane for, thoughts during games, when to go for fourth down, when to, punt, when to, push the envelope a little bit. And that was something that Frank relied pretty heavily on when Shane was back at Virginia Tech from 2011 to 2015. And, I think that everyone he's worked for, whether that's Phil Fulmer, whether it's Kirby Smart, whether it's, George O'Leary, I mean, like, everyone kind of lauded his football sense and his football IQ. He's not a guy who's going to kind of like out coach himself. He's pretty, in tune with the flow of the game. He doesn't try and, get too crazy or anything like that. Like, he really follows it along pretty well. And I think you've seen that on the sidelines too. I mean, he's definitely a rah-rah guy. Was very excited after the game, running around and throwing, haymakers, almost celebrating and, pointing toward the fans and all that. But no, as far as, composure on the sideline go, Shane's a pretty even keel guy for the most part.
Man, no doubt about it. Now, Ben, you had the opportunity to cover Mississippi State, and I guess I would ask you to contrast, when Mike Leach arrived, he was trying to build a program, a first-year coach, to the start that Shane Beamer has gotten off to, and how do those programs compare? Is Shane have a harder job than Mike Leach did at Mississippi State?
I'd say the harder part comes with your in-state counterpart. I mean, Mississippi State and Ole Miss are, generally speaking, on similar planes and similar trajectories, whereas, Clemson, will knock on South Carolina, but I mean, Clemson's playing a different sport than some of these other schools in the SEC and the ACC as well. And, with how good they've been the last, decade under Dabo, I mean, that makes things more difficult. But, as far as resources go, South Carolina's got as many resources as any program in the country. The budget is there. The support is there from the fan base. The upgrades that they've had to the football, facilities in the last, 5-10 years were much needed, but are really, really impressive. I mean, it looks like an NFL complex over there, and not over across the street from Williams-Brice Stadium. So, I think it's a difficult job in the sense that, you don't necessarily have the built-in geography that some of these other schools do. I mean, Georgia's a good example. LSU is a good example. Like, you've got programs that can recruit and have a ton of top flight guys in their backyard. South Carolina produces, at most, I don't know, 8, 10, 12 guys in a given year that are really SEC caliber level. And, you got to fight Georgia, you got to fight Florida, you got to fight LSU, Alabama for those guys as well, and Clemson as well. So, South Carolina's got to get a little creative in their geography, which just makes it a little hard. Mississippi obviously splits the Mississippi kids, but that's a state that churns out a lot of football talent, and underratedly so. So I think they're a little bit different. And I think that, South Carolina financially is definitely more well-equipped than Mississippi State. But as far as pecking order, like if you compare spots in the East and West, I think that, It's similar. I mean, it's two teams that, historically have not been very good and have been better in recent years. And Mississippi State's been good under Dan Mullen. South Carolina had Lou Holtz and Spurrier. And, there were moments under Muschamp, but it was pretty inconsistent. So, as far as trajectory goes, especially over the last 20 years, I mean, they mirror each other pretty similarly.
Now, you just mentioned Dan Mullen in the same sentence with Lou Holtz and Steve Spurrier, Ben. I'm going to give you a pass on that one, albeit Mullen did have success there. The last SEC East team to beat Alabama was South Carolina with Steve Spurrier quite a while ago. About this specific South Carolina team, Zeb Nolan, what an interesting story. He's a guy from right here, the shadows of Athens and Watkinsville, Oconee County High School, about 500 yards from where I'm sitting. And this kid is really kind of shown some gumption. Now, gumption and storylines are one thing. Luke Doty's a really talented guy. That's another. Still, I got to think, if I was a betting man, doesn't Beamer got to give the local guy a shot against Georgia? And wouldn't you rather wait to bring Luke Doty in? And I don't want to say this isn't a winnable game, but it just seems like all indications would be you would go with Zeb Nolan. Are my sports writer instincts off the radar here? Or do you have any hunches or thoughts on that?
No, I think you're right, and I feel the same way. I think that, for one, it's an awesome storyline, right? A hometown kid comes home, I'm licking my chops at that. That's awesome. I love the idea of that, but I think you're right. I think that the reality is that, Luke Doty is obviously still getting back to full health. And I know you were on the conference call last night too, but, Shane Beamer was talking about that, there's no trepidation about throwing Luke out there on Saturday against Georgia. But I think that, there was a lot of talk that he was going to be ready to play this weekend against East Carolina. Now, we've all kind of circled Georgia as the game that he might actually fully be ready to go. But, if you look at South Carolina's schedule, I mean, the next game on the slate is Kentucky. And you got Troy after that, and then, if I'm not mistaken, a trip to Knoxville after that. That's kind of a really crucial stretch for this team, and if they want to get into that 5-6 win threshold, that's their chance to do it. And I think you set yourself up a little bit better for that if Luke doesn't play this week, or at least doesn't go full go this week. Again, I think it's a great story to have the hometown kid go and start at Georgia this weekend, but I would be surprised if it wasn't Zeb Noland. If it is Luke Doty, I mean, look, things can change and things can happen, but I would say I'd be surprised if it's Luke Doty.
You just said things can change and things can happen. And I guess I would emphasize things can happen because they're getting ready to play a defensive line that's been downright ferocious. I think they had 9 sacks against Cincinnati and a very mobile quarterback and Desmond Ridder. And then I believe they had 7 against DJ Ungalaye, another mobile quarterback. I wonder about the South Carolina line. This is something, Ben, that, I've heard you follow up on and some writers there express a little concern about. Tell us more about the South Carolina offensive line.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's 2 games into the season. It's not necessarily too early to sound the alarms or anything like that. But, when you look at it, South Carolina's played 2 teams that, no disrespect to Eastern Illinois and East Carolina, but, teams that generally speaking SEC programs should be able to handle, right? Eastern Illinois is a team that hasn't won more than 3 games since 2017. East Carolina, I mean, look, Mike Houston's got that thing going in the right direction, but, East Carolina hasn't been really, as good as they've been since, Ruffin McNeil got fired in 2015. And so when you look at that South Carolina, and then when you look at it, you look at the Pro Football Focus numbers today, for example, right? South Carolina ranks dead last in pass protection right now, and that's not good given the fact of who you've played. And look, East Carolina's got some guys on that defensive line, and they do a pretty good job of creating pressure, and they do a good job of scheming up some blitzes and things like that. But if you're South Carolina, the pass protection has to be better. Zeb Nolan can't be running for his life against, Zeb Nolan was running for his life against East Carolina. I mean, I can only imagine what he's going to be running for against Georgia next weekend. So, when you look at that, things have got to shore up. Some of that falls on the tight end. Some of that falls on the running backs as well. But, you got to find a way to keep your quarterback upright. And, we saw Zeb Nolan throw away, frankly, too many passes last week in part because there was too much pressure in his face. And some of that's a credit to East Carolina and scheme and what they did. But, at the same time, you got to block the guy in front of you. And sometimes guys just ran free, and that just can't happen.
South Carolina's got some talent there in the backfield. It took them a little while to get the run game going. Tell us a little bit about the South Carolina run game, because that's probably their best defense against a really good pass rush.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, South Carolina on Saturday, I mean, you could see 5 running backs. I mean, it goes that deep. And, it's led. Kevin Harris is the guy that people circle, led the SEC in rushing last year at over 1,100 yards and 15 touchdowns in 10 games. I mean, it's a really, really impressive effort for a team that, frankly, just wasn't very good. You combine that with Marshawn Lloyd, he's former top 50 recruit. Juju McDowell is a guy that has gotten a lot of touches in the early going. And then, but you look at this group, like it's a group, and Zaquandre White, excuse me, there's the other guy that I'm thinking of. As a former one-time Florida State guy, went to junior college, ended up at South Carolina, and has done a really good job, and went for over 100 yards in the opener. So you've got 4 guys in this running back room that like legitimately will get 10, 12 carries in a game and could handle even up to like 25 or 30 if, things were a little bit different and there were a few less guys. So it's a really interesting group. I think that, Shane Beamer has tended to use the hot hand and just kind of, roll with who's running well. We saw it against East Carolina. Juju McDowell is a freshman. He's a Georgia kid, 3-star kid who was committed to NC State, flipped to South Carolina. He ends up coming to South Carolina, and he's been, the guy that we've heard about every week during preseason camp. It's like, this is the guy. And, unlike most years, he's actually done something, right? Like we've seen him show out. So, he yesterday, I guess Saturday now, went for 11 carries, over 70 yards, and they really just leaned on him in the last 2 drives. His kick, he had about a 70-yard kick return that set up a game-tying field goal. I mean, he's a guy that can absolutely fly, is really electric in the return game, and can do a lot. And he's only 5'9". I think it was JJ and Igbare, the defensive end for South Carolina, was joking the other day after the game. He was like, "Yeah, Juju's like 5'2" or something like that, but the dude can run." And so we got some clarity. Juju is 5'9", to clarify, but he's 5'9", about 180 pounds, sopping wet, but he's a guy that can fly. So you combine that with Kevin Harris, with Marshawn Lloyd, with Zaquandre White, and you got a lot of running backs and a lot of talent in that room that can, really mix it up. And it's a lot of guys that do a lot of different things too, right? They all kind of complement each other. So I think you'll see, at least 4 running backs on Saturday.
Yeah, I saw he had a lot of juice. I was impressed. 5'9", 190. He's about the same size as Stetson Bennett. Georgia, with some questions at their quarterback position also, as we're all still waiting to hear about JT Daniels. Kirby Smart updated his health today and said it predictably enough, said it's day by day and he's getting better, and still not real clear on the quarterbacks. And I got a feeling, Ben, that even if Kirby was clear on the quarterbacks, he probably wouldn't be sending any smoke signals to South Carolina. Coach Beamer really does understand how Kirby goes about work and knows kind of how Kirby's going to game plan. But the elephant in the room is that the former South Carolina head coach is on the Georgia sidelines as a special teams coach. And every time a coach tries to tell me that it's not really a big deal, my inclination is that it might be a bigger deal than they're letting on. I've got to think that Coach Muschamp's knowledge of the Gamecocks personnel gives Georgia a bit of an advantage. How do you think the players respond to playing against their former head coach?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting dynamic. I mean, it's always a little bit weird, and Kirby was talking about it today, right? Like, you guys see this and we talk about it all the time, but it doesn't really matter. I kind of tend to err with what you were saying, right? Like, it probably matters a little bit, but and Shane Beamer said the same thing. So I guess, I took one out of Kirby's playbook, or I guess on the early side, but I think you're right. Like, I think it's interesting. I think that for players, it's interesting. It's obviously a guy that theoretically recruited you to South Carolina. You spent a lot of time with and have a relationship with, and that's always a weird dynamic. I mean, it's not quite the same as what we saw with like Edo and his son this past weekend, but I mean, it's not that far off, right? It's a little different, but no, I think you're right. Like, I think it matters. I think the personnel and knowing what guys can do does help Georgia, certainly, and I think that. You don't have to be a rocket science to look at the South Carolina's roster and see some of these guys, but DeCarrion Joyner is a guy who can line up on a whole different number of places, and that's something that Will Muschamp's going to know what his strengths are and weaknesses are, whatever, right? And those are things that can be exploited to some degree. So I think it helps. I think it's definitely interesting. It's a fascinating storyline, and how much it helps, I can't really say, but I would imagine it helps a decent bit.
A few years ago, I was talking with Deebo Samuel at the Senior Bowl. And man, he's having a great career with the 49ers. I wish I would have picked him on my fantasy football team now. But we were talking about the Georgia game, and he said that he thought Georgia was South Carolina's biggest rival. He also said Georgia was tougher than Clemson, something we finally got to see those teams settle a little bit of that in week one, game that maybe could have gone either way in the eyes of the Clemson fans. I kind of thought Georgia outplayed him, and Clemson was probably fortunate to be as close as they were. But when we talk about rivalries, Ben, in South Carolina, and obviously the East Carolina game was special, especially since South Carolina played there. I liked that touch. I liked seeing Florida play at South Florida. I like seeing SEC teams go into these other stadiums occasionally. That said, I think it's ridiculous that Georgia plays at Georgia Tech every other year. That's a completely waste of a game. A lot of Georgia fans mad at me for saying that, but I divert, South Carolina's rivalries. Obviously, Clemson's number one. Does it feel like this is a rivalry game? Do they really look at Georgia as a border state rival? And are the Bulldogs number two on their list?
I think you can make that argument. I mean, I think that you run into the same kind of thing that Clemson and Georgia are playing at a maybe different level that South Carolina is right now. But, aspirationally, right, like that's what South Carolina wants to be. And, we're not that far removed from Steve Spurrier winning 11 games 3 years in a row. I mean, I know it's, 7-8 years ago now, but in the grand scheme, like that's not that long ago. And that's not that far removed. South Carolina was one of the 3, 4, 5 best programs in the conference, not just the East, but across the league. And, when you look at that, like, I think that if you're South Carolina, I think Georgia's a team that you want to be like, that you want to emulate. And I know the history is there more for Georgia and has been historically better, obviously. South Carolina is a program that's hovered around 500 at best for most of its, time in the SEC since 1992. And so, that plays into it. But I think at the same time, like if you're South Carolina, this is a big game. It's a game you circle, right? Like if you want to be the best, you got to beat the best. I know that's super cliche, but if you want to fight to be at the top of the SEC, like Shane Beamer wants to, whenever that day might come, like you got to be able to play with Georgia. You got to be able to play with Florida. You got to be able to play when, I guess, hypothetically Tennessee, when they're clicking at some point, maybe ever, and you got to be able to beat teams like Kentucky and Missouri and whoever else, right? Like, you got to stack up against those teams and you got to be able to go somewhere and smack someone in the mouth and win. South Carolina did that 2 years ago. Now, I think Kirby said today, right, that it was a little more on what Georgia didn't do than what South Carolina did. And there's maybe some fighting words, I guess. So maybe that'll spark something, but maybe we'll see that hanging in the facility this week. But, I think that if you're South Carolina, like this is a game that matters. It's not that far down the road, right? You're 2.5 hours to Athens. Like you're recruiting a lot of the same kids. Like South Carolina has, I think, 5 or 6 kids in their 2022 class out of the state of Georgia. Donovan Westmoreland was a Georgia commit at one point. Like these are teams that see each other on the road a lot and the recruiting trail a lot. So I think it's a game that matters, certainly. I don't know where it necessarily falls in the pecking order, but it's one that matters. That's for sure.
We talked about that upset a couple of years ago. That was the first time in Sanford Stadium history that a top 5 ranked Georgia team lost to an unranked opponent. And certainly the 3 interceptions, the missed field goal by Rodrigo Blankenship, and South Carolina had a bye week. Georgia had 5 opponents that year, Ben, that had a bye week before they played the Bulldogs. Not exactly a favorable schedule from the SEC home office there. And Will Muschamp and the Gamecocks cash in. We know how well Will knows Kirby, and almost as if he was in the playbook. And now he's on this team, and Beamer, a guy that knows Kirby Smart. If you were going to design a recipe for an upset on Saturday night in Sanford Stadium, what would be your 3 keys for a South Carolina upset?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obvious, but one's going to be South Carolina's defensive line. I think that when you look at that defensive line, like, I don't think it's too far to say that this is probably one of the 2, 3, 4 best defensive lines in the league. Like this is a team that goes really deep on the defensive line. You've got, former 5-star recruits, former 4-star recruits. Like you got guys on this defensive line. Kingsley Enagbare. I mean, that's a guy who a lot of people see as a potential first-round pick in the NFL draft next year. Zach Pickens, if he has the year that he could have this year, like he's a guy that could leave early and be a first-round pick. You got other guys like Aaron Sterling. Zach Birch is a former 5-star recruit. Like say what you will about Will Muschamp and what he did at South Carolina, but he recruited that defensive line and recruited it well. And, if they're going to have a chance, they're going to have to cause some problems for Stetson Bennett or whoever it is under center. I guess that's obviously still a question mark, but that's the number one thing I'd circle. The second is, and I guess this kind of goes hand in hand, but is South Carolina's secondary. I mean, look, Stetson Bennett was, what was he, like 5 for 5 for 248 yards to start the game the other day, if I'm not mistaken. So you look at that, like South Carolina's secondary has been maligned a lot this offseason. You lose J.C. Horn, who's, an all-world cornerback. You lose Israel Mukuamu, who's, as good a defensive back as there was in the league last year. And obviously, you mentioned the 3 interceptions. That's, the guy who got them. So, you lose guys like that. It's tough. And, look, credit to Shane Beamer. They went out. They signed some guys in the transfer portal. I think they brought in 9 transfers this year. And if I'm not mistaken, I think 6 were on defense, 5 or 6 were on defense. And a lot of them were in the secondary. So they've pieced it together. It's not necessarily looked super pretty, but they've been good. I mean, Cam Smith is a guy that I think has a legitimate shot at, second, third team all SEC type season at corner. And, they lost Karan Prunty, who was a guy who they thought was going to come in and be a number 1 corner. But, they've pieced it together and have done some nice things. And I think the secondary can be good. And I think, frankly, this South Carolina defense is a little bit better than we think or we thought it was going to be over the offseason. I think they've got some pieces. And I think really highly of Clayton White. I think he does a really good job. He's a guy that's been on some SEC radars in recent years and, is getting his shot at South Carolina, but was someone that was, thought really highly of the last few coaching cycles as well. So I think that it's a good South Carolina defense. And I think, like I said, the second part piece of this is probably the secondary. And then, the last part is frankly South Carolina's offensive line. I know I harped on it all the time earlier, but Zeb Nolan can have enough time to throw. Like, he's a guy who can make some plays. He's big armed. He's pretty accurate with the ball. His numbers haven't been super good, but have been pretty good. And I know it's obviously a step up in competition, but if they can keep him upright and let him make some throws like he did down the stretch in the East Carolina game the other night. I mean, I was saying this on the radio earlier today is that, he's a guy that, when it came down to it, when it was winning time and you needed plays, he made the throws he needed to make. I mean, he hit Josh Vann for a 45-yard catch down the sideline that was, a really nice throw. And then, I think it was the go-ahead touchdown at the time or game-tying touchdown at the time. Hit to Carry-On Joyner on a pass that he kind of, lofted it over a linebacker, but in front of a safety, and DeCarrion Joyner went up and got it. I mean, it was a hell of a throw. So, I mean, the guy has some talent. So if he has some time to throw, like, he can help ease things in the running game a little bit and let that group go to work. So, so I guess to recap it, just defensive line, secondary, and offensive line.
Talking to Ben Portnoy, he writes for the Columbia State in South Carolina. Ben, I wonder, South Carolina football history, we've talked about some moments. I mean, is Steve Spurrier the Babe Ruth in the building? Is it Lou Holtz? Is there a coach that Gamecock fans like to rally around?
Yeah, I think it's Spurrier, but I think when you look at it, like, I think it's fascinating because, to be honest, till I moved here and started this job, I don't think I necessarily had the same kind of appreciation I do now for, what Lou Holtz did here. And when you look at it, I mean, look, Lou Holtz and Steve Spurrier are probably 2 of the best college football coaches in the last 50 years. I mean, those are guys that are at the top of this game, right? And you look at that, like, they came here and they won. Now, it took really good coaches and really good staffs and really good players, but the guys who won here were really good coaches. And, when you look at what Lou Holtz did, took over an 0-11 or 1-11 team and got them to pretty consistent, bowl team, pretty consistently in bowl games. I mean, that does a lot, and that's a big flip to switch. So, or switch to flip. There we go. But I think that, when I would say that Spurrier's the guy, some of it's recency bias, I guess. But, when you look at what Lou Holtz did, I mean, it's pretty impressive. And I think it set the stage for what Steve Spurrier did.
William Bryce Stadium versus Mississippi State. You got a favorite stadium there? Is it Scott Field?
Look, I like them both a lot. I gotta say I'm partial to Davis Wade Stadium. I think it's a really underrated atmosphere. I think that, I think Williams Bryce is at the top of the SEC for sure. It's up there, and same for Sanford Stadium as well. But I think that in the pecking order, I think Mississippi State's a little underrated. And those cowbells, when they get going, they're really loud.
Well, that should be pretty interesting to find out what Sanford Stadium environment's going to be like on Saturday night. South Carolina, big underdog, going to try to pull the upset on the Bulldogs and clip some more of those hedges. I know that's fresh in the minds of a lot of these Georgia fans. I'm sure they'll give South Carolina a nice welcome on Saturday night at Sanford Stadium. Ben, I want to thank you for joining us. Before you go, can you share some of your social media contact information where people can follow you?
Yeah, definitely. Just at B Portnoy 15 on Twitter, and you can read on thestate.com. So nothing too crazy, but pretty easy to find.
Great stuff. I appreciate it, Ben. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Mike, thanks so much.
Great to have Ben Portnoy join us. Really talented young writer for the Columbia State, covers the Gamecocks, and you could tell that just a wealth of information. I really encourage you to follow him on Twitter. It's a really good way for a fan to check out the game in advance, is to check out the other team's Twitter account, check out the other beat writers, see what they're talking about. I mean, you hear a ton from DogNation.com about what's going on with the Georgia Bulldogs, with Dog Nation Daily with Brandon Adams every day at 10. And of course, Connor Riley has his show on Tuesday night, Connor in Coverage, and Jeff Sentel's Intel Wednesday night, and then our Cover 4 feature Thursday. But I always like to look at what the other team is talking about. What do they think about Georgia? What are their challenges? And you heard Ben Portnoy talk about the importance of the line of scrimmage, that South Carolina thinks they've got a good defensive line. South Carolina, a decent secondary, and then the importance for their offensive line to hold together against the really talented Georgia defensive front. There's all sorts of components to success. And, you know, I think about Ingles, and I think about all the components that make them such a successful place and such a reliable place for us, right? I mean, we're still dealing with some of this COVID fallout, such a difficult time. And Ingles hasn't taken a day off from any of that. They've been there to service us from the beginning, making sure that we have all the supplies and the goods that we need. I want to thank Ingles personally. And I want to take a moment and play this message so we can all recognize Ingles.
It's in our hearts to feel for real. There's been ups and downs, turnarounds, good days and some bad. But we stand together for worse and for better. We'll always have your back. With open arms, heart to heart, hand in hand. Community strong.
And welcome back. Mike Griffith here, the second half of the Ingles on the Beat show. And you might have heard in the first half of the show, we mentioned JT Daniels' injury. Kirby Smart telling the media today that he's definitely improved, but this remains a day-by-day situation. And you kind of wonder, if you're Kirby Smart, you don't take any chances with JT Daniels against South Carolina. At least I don't think you do. Now, remember, I wrote about it today in the stock report, and we'll talk about the stock report, but Kirby's acronym for win, right? Win. Well, win, of course he wants to win, but look deeper. W, what's I? Important, N, now. What's important now? It's a Georgia acronym that Kirby shares with his players and tells them, you know, guys, look, whenever things get really hard, whenever you're starting to feel overwhelmed, just remember to win. Remember to apply what's important now. And I know there were a lot of Georgia fans that were maybe surprised, some even upset that Kirby didn't start a younger quarterback that, you know, could be the starter in 2022, 23. That's not now. It's what's important now. And what's important now is for Georgia to make absolutely sure that they don't get tripped up, that they don't have that upset special of a game. Look, UAB beat Jacksonville State 31-0. And I know most of you already recognize that Jacksonville State beat Florida State last Saturday night. Now, transitive properties don't always work, but it tells you that was a capable team. It was an experienced team. So you've got a defense at UAB that's got 9 of 11 starters back, including their secondary. And if you're Georgia, you don't want to throw a young man out there that hasn't had any extended action. For the first time, he's dealing with all these elements and excitement in Sanford Stadium with the capacity crowd on hand, on national television, with an unsettled team around him. Maybe if you have a veteran offensive line, maybe if you have veteran receivers. But as is, one of the takeaways out of the Clemson game was that receivers were lined up in the wrong place. And you don't want to have that young quarterback having to try to not only manage all these external factors for the first time, but also have to deal with some of that inexperience in the receiving corps. Guy runs the wrong route, right? We saw that happen last year with Dwan Mathis, really talented guy. Dwan making his first start had looked good in all the practices, but when Jermaine Burton ran the wrong route, it led to an interception early on. There were some snap issues, remember, with Trey Hill? Well, this was only Cedric Van Pran's second start. So when you've got all those unknown elements on the field, you probably want a more experienced quarterback that's been in those environments before, right? And albeit the crowds last year were reduced, but still Stetson played in Tuscaloosa. He played in the state of Florida in the game in Jacksonville. He played in Neyland Stadium. He had to come in and play from behind in Reynolds Razorback Stadium. So I thought it was a good play just because of the experience. And Kirby said he felt Stetson would have a calming effect on the team. And boy, did he ever. And give kudos to Todd Monken as well for scheming that early touchdown. You know, there's a reason that play was open. And I wrote a story about this. I talked to UAB coach, I saw what UAB coach Bill Clark had to say about this. And Bill said they did a good job of using our rules against us. And what he meant by that was this. Georgia used a bunch formation, and Clark indicated that, you know, Kirby knew that the Blazers were going to come in intent on stopping the run. So Georgia showed a formation that they had done a lot of runs out of. They built a tendency. And so UAB was playing the run based on the tendency that Georgia had shown. Well, Todd Monken, in his genius, the self-scout, said, you know what? All we've done for the most part is run out of this formation. Against these guys, we're going to change it up. They're going to play run, and we're going to go deep. And sure enough, you saw Jermaine Burton run by the secondary for the Blazers. And how much momentum was that to be able to score on a play like that right out of the gate? I mean, I think that meant everything, you know, wow, boom, all of a sudden 73-yard touchdown pass. And Georgia's up 7-0 in the first minute of the game. And I think everybody's nerves, you know, and then the next time down the field, Stetson Bennett, leads Georgia down the field on a drive. I want to say 5 plays, 55 yards. And there's that swing pass to Kenny McIntosh. And didn't Kenny do a nice job tipping that pass back to himself with one hand and then lowering the shoulder, taking on that UAB player at the goal line for the score? And it's 14-0. We're not even 5 minutes in. And then Carson Beck comes in. And here's the thing. Kirby had told Stetson and Carson Beck on Thursday, you know, guys, this is how we're going to do it. You know, 2-1, 2-1, 2 series for Stetson, 1 for Carson, 2 more series for Stetson, 1 for Carson, right? And so everybody knew on Thursday what the deal was. And you want to prepare your kids. You don't want to surprise them. You want everybody to be mentally prepared. And if you think about this, this is kind of interesting. When Kirby was asked if Carson was his number 2 last week, he was. What people assumed was that JT was the number 1, when in fact, Stetson was the number 1, right? Stetson, a guy who had experience, Stetson, a guy who started 5 games last year. Kirby's thinking to himself, I'm not going to make the same mistake that I made a year ago in Arkansas when Georgia trotted Dwan Mathis out there and Dwan wasn't ready for that moment because things went wrong around Dwan and Dwan wasn't able to settle it down. And so Kirby's covering his bases. What's important now? And then the other saying, which, you know, when we had the KM Squared show, and I know a lot of you watched that with Kendall Milton and Kenny McIntosh, their favorite saying was, keep the main thing the main thing. And the main thing every Saturday is that game. And Kirby, certainly, he recruits, he plans, folks, you know that, but he's not going to overlook anybody. I remember one of my favorite sayings from Gene Stallings, the Alabama coach, when I covered the Tide was, you don't think it's a big game, just lose it. You'll find out how big of a game it is. So they're all big games to these coaches. And Stetson played wonderfully. I was so impressed. That was such an interesting game, fascinating game, really, when you think about all the dynamics that went into that 56-7 win. You know, Carson came in there and he did look like he struggled a little bit with the speed of the game. He did throw the pick 6. He did throw the ball in the dirt. And that's to be expected. That was his first extended action. You know, he'll be that much better in the second game. I mean, look at Keely Ringo, for example. You know, Keely Ringo against Clemson was tackling guys. I mean, those were some pretty horrific pass interference calls, but Keeley against UAB was that much smarter, that much better. We talked with Keeley earlier today, and he said, I learned from that I just need to stay poised. When I've got my back to the ball, I just need to stay poised and not panic and trust yourself, trust your technique. And it takes those live reps. And Kirby mentioned that on his coach's show last week. You could do something 1,000 times in practice, but until you do it in the game, right? And that's what you don't really know. So I did a stock report, and I like the stock report's one of my favorite features. I do it every Monday, and it has to do with whose stock is soaring, whose stock is up, and whose stock is even, right? I don't ever want to see anybody's stock is down, because in my mind, it's really not down unless you're out of the program. As long as you're a part of the Georgia program and you're getting coached up by Kirby Smart and that staff, I think your stock is pretty solid, right? And you may not play your best game, but as long as you're in the huddle, as long as you're going to the team meetings, I think your stock stays even. So to me, there's some guys, though, whose stock really did soar. Obviously, Stetson Bennett, 10 of 12, 288 yards. He was the SEC Offensive Player of the Week, and he was also a Davey O'Brien, which is a National Senior Award. They recognized him on their weekly awards as well. So 5 touchdown passes, it tied a school record. Wouldn't it have been something if Stetson Bennett set the school record with 6 touchdown passes? And now I wonder, is that a record that JT might set this year whenever he gets back? I said Kirby Smart's stock was up, right? Not that he needs it. He makes about $7 or $8 million a year already. But, it would have been easy for Kirby to, just go with the press, the guy, a Carson Beck guy with the big upside, but he really thought it out. He was very careful, and the performances of the quarterbacks really showed you that, wow, the head coach knows what he's doing. Jake Camarda, man, is he killing it. These punts are like a thing of beauty. They're not only long, but they're so high. Nobody's getting any return. He's burying so many of these kicks inside the opponent's 20, and the growth and maturity from Jake Camarda, it's really impressive, really impressive. Brock Bowers, how about number 19? All right, we're all starting to get to know him better. We'd heard so much about Brock, but we didn't believe it. Did you believe it? Did you believe that there was going to be a freshman who was going to come in and be the team's leading receiver through the first 2 games as a tight end? And now we see the 40-inch vertical, and now we see the 4.5 40. I don't think many people really expected this outside the clubhouse. But right now, right as things stand right now, Brock Bowers is the best pass-catching option out there. Jordan Davis makes my stock soaring list, number 99. I think we're all going to remember how Jordan ran down that quarterback in the open field. And this wasn't just any quarterback. This was their mobile quarterback. And 99 just tracks him down, and you're going, oh, my goodness, that big man can really move. What a moment for Georgia. What a moment for Jordan Davis at 345. And one more reason why I think he's a first-round lock. Channing Tindall is another guy whose stock is up. Channing, a guy, I believe, from South Carolina, and a guy who just about had 8 tackles, I want to say. The angles in the pursuit of this guy is something to behold. Great open field tackler, has really matured into a strong player. I think there's some competition there. Quay Walker, Channing Tindall, something to keep an eye on. Not my next category. Maybe not soaring, but these players' performance was a stock up. These are guys I'm looking at that say, you know what, he took another step. I mentioned Kenny McIntosh a minute ago. I thought Kenny was the most impressive back in this game. I thought Kendall was the most impressive back in game 1. Zamir ran also very hard. In this game, I thought Kenny was the most impressive back. The cutback, the catch, very impressive how well Kenny plays in the backfield, whether he's taking handoffs, whether he's going out as a receiver. It's that cutback ability. And then you saw some power in this most recent game. Just such a talented player. Ladd McConkey is really, when Georgia signed him, he was a bit of a project, and we thought he was undersized. And, my goodness, it could be 2 or 3 years or maybe 4 before Ladd McConkey gets on the field. But when I watch him, he's got so much electricity, juice, and energy, not only catching the ball and running after the pass, but seeing him do the things that he's doing on special teams. That's a football player. So Ladd McConkey is another player on my stock up list. Adonai Mitchell, Justin Robinson, got to mention both of these guys. Two young, exciting targets. Adonai, a true freshman, gets 2 catches for 42. Justin, a second-year player who was slowed down by injuries last year, his first touchdown catch. Let's see if Adonai and Justin evolve more this week. I think they took a big step. Keely Ringo, as I mentioned, against Clemson, 2 pass interference penalties. This game, an interception. You got to be impressed with that. Stock even. Arian Smith, I did see him catch a 61-yard touchdown pass, but a guy that needs to get more sound with the playbook. A guy that if he puts an emphasis on football, you almost wonder, could he be like Tyreek Hill special in terms of his talent? So fast, 4.23 40. Impressed with Arian. Need to see more. Need to see assignment sound. Jermaine Burton, 73-yard touchdown catch. Yes, that was huge, but he also had a holding penalty. You might say, Mike, you sure are hard on Jermaine Burton. Well, the reason why is because I believe Jermaine has star power. I don't mean just being steady. I don't mean just being a starter. I believe that Jermaine Burton has the potential to be one of the all-time great receivers at Georgia. And yes, it's a steep learning curve. And maybe it's not fair to expect so much, but this is year 2. And this is a championship window. And it's really up to Jermaine Burton to grab a hold of this moment and recognize that this may be his best chance at a national championship while he's at Georgia. I'm not going to say it's his only chance, but it may be his best chance because that defense, folks, they're going to move about 9 of those starters on the NFL after this year. Kendall Milton. Now, Kendall led the team with 8 carries. The Blazers did a pretty good job of hemming him in. I think that, Georgia's offensive line had a pretty rough game, but still, I needed to see Kendall execute on a 3rd and 2. I didn't like the play call. It was a kind of an off tackle run where you're getting sideways. I don't know why Georgia just didn't hit it straight. If you give Kendall Milton the ball on a dive, I think he's going to get you 2 yards. I really feel like he's that powerful, that talented. And if you send him up the middle like a rocket, he's either going to find that seam or he's going to bounce. And I just wish they would give this running back a chance, or maybe even give him a toss. If you want to run wide, give Kendall a toss so he gets a chance to get some open field momentum going and do some things. Zamir White, 7 carries, like Kendall, had trouble getting loose. And I didn't think that he ran with the same physicality that he showed against Clemson. So it's pretty interesting to me looking at breaking that down and kind of rewinding some players that we thought really impressed and some players that, maybe had room for improvement. Georgia comes in number 2 in the AP Top 25. I had them number 1 on my Super 16 ballot. You might wonder what the Super 16 is. The Super 16 is a poll that's done by the Football Writers Association of America. You'll see a lot of famous names on there, Tony Barnhart among them. And we vote for the top 16 teams. So here's how my poll looked. I had Georgia number 1. I had Georgia number 1. I had Alabama number 2. I was more impressed with Georgia's win over UAB than I was Alabama's win over Mercer. I've got Clemson number 3. I think we might have saw the 2 best teams in the country on opening. I think Clemson is doggone good. Obviously, they got a win over South Carolina State. It'll be a minute before Clemson plays anybody of significance. I moved Oregon all the way up to number 4. For the Ducks to go on the road and beat the Buckeyes. Also, noon kickoff. Think about that. That's 9 o'clock Pacific time. To me, that was a really not cool thing that Ohio State did, putting them having a noon kick, trying to use that time zone against Oregon. I thought that was kind of cheap. Glad to see the Ducks get that win. Number 5, Iowa. The Iowa Hawkeyes over Iowa State in week 1. Iowa with a big win as well over Indiana. I'm impressed with Iowa. They're number 5 on my list. They had a good season last year. I thought got overlooked. Number 6, Oklahoma. They're undefeated. They did struggle in the opener. We saw that struggle against Tulane. There's a lot of upside there, though. I'm going to make them number 6. Number 7, Cincinnati. Here's a team that's only lost in the last 2 seasons, came to Georgia. I don't know how you couldn't be impressed with the Bearcats and Desmond Ridder. So 7 Cincinnati, 8 Penn State. The Nittany Lions opened the year last week with a win over Wisconsin. I like James Franklin. I think that's a good football team. Number 9, I have Texas A&M. What a struggle in Colorado. I want to give Carl Durrell some credit, though. Second-year coach with the Buffaloes. He was the freshman coach of the year, the first-year coach of the year, I should say, last year with Colorado. And I think he's done a really nice job. That can be a tough team to play. But I got the Aggies number 9. We'll see what they do this week against Arkansas. Number 10, Notre Dame. Notre Dame had their struggles with Toledo. They finally pulled it out. That's a talented team. We know that. We've seen Georgia go toe-to-toe with the Irish a couple times over the last 4 or 5 years. Always a good game. I dropped Ohio State down to 11. I can't reward Ohio State for, coming from behind to beat Minnesota in the opener. The fact that they used that time zone against Oregon like that and still trailed just about the whole game, not impressed. Number 12, UCLA. Of course, UCLA took LSU down a peg. Got to give the Bruins credit for that. 13, Arkansas breaks into my poll. Big win over Texas. I like what Sam Pittman's done there. There's a lot of buy-in. There's a lot of pride. That win over Texas, probably one of the best wins and maybe of the millennium for the Hogs. I mean, the program is in need of a win like that, and they delivered. 14, Virginia Tech. Like Virginia Tech, saw what they did against North Carolina in the opener. Their defense was impressive. I dropped Iowa State down to 15. I guess I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt. So many people say they're so experienced and they're one of the top 2 teams in the Big 12. I'm going to keep them in my poll for now. Number 16, UCF. Like Gus Malzahn, like the Knights, they beat Boise State early this year. I'm going to keep an eye on UCF. And we'll see what Florida does this week against Alabama. Obviously, if Florida wins, they'll get into my top 16, but I'm just not there yet with the Gators. Emory Jones has had 2 interceptions in each of his first 2 games, and I've got questions. And when I've got questions, I can't fake it. I've got to, as we say, we got to keep it real. So this week's matchup will be interesting moving forward now. Looking at this game, knowing what we know about South Carolina, I think this is a game that Georgia should dominate. I really do. South Carolina quarterback play has been shaky. Zeb Nolan, 24 years old. There's a reason Georgia didn't recruit him. I don't think he has the arm talent to expose this secondary. This front is so good. I can't imagine South Carolina being able to run the ball effectively or consistently. Last year's game was just such domination by the Bulldogs and against then Mike Bobo-led team. So I like the Dogs big in this game. I think it's because Georgia can run the ball, and I think that sets up the play action. I don't know whether or not JT Daniels is going to play, and I can't even hazard a guess. I know that he wants to play. I think he'll play when he's ready. But if you're Georgia, again, like Kirby might have dropped a hint when he said the thing we know is that you don't want to take a chance on aggravating it. You're going to need JT Daniels to beat Arkansas, okay? I don't know that you need JT against South Carolina or Vanderbilt. And maybe it's a situation where you see Stetson and Carson play more and you get to see some good things and some development from Carson Beck. But again, win. What's important now? Got to do what you got to do to win that football game. So that'll be interesting to keep up with the JT Daniels injury front. And then we'll also wonder when some of these other players might come back. Darnell Washington and Tyke Smith were out of their walking boots, and they both had foot injuries. I mean, that's your star and one of your impact tight ends. Those are 2 really important components to the team that when they return, the level of play is going to go up. Right? They're going to raise everybody's level of play up. Dominic Blaylock, another guy, when will he be back? I think he's a very capable receiver that could really help out this receiving corps. So I'll look for the injuries and who's going to be back. I think Georgia's the crowd at Sanford Stadium. It'll be a night game. That's going to be exciting. It's such a great setting for college football. And even though Kirby said he wasn't going to bring up 2 years ago, the players are talking about it, right? The players always know. And hey, I want to thank everybody for joining me tonight. If you got any questions or comments, put them down there in the comment section and I'll circle back and answer your questions and comments. And tomorrow night, Connor in Coverage will be on this channel. Wednesday night, Jeff Centel with his Centel's Intel. And then I'm guessing that we're going to have a Cover 4 broadcast with myself and Brandon Adams, Jeff Centel, and Connor Riley, and we'll chop it up a little bit more. For now, everyone, have a great week, and thanks for joining me on the Ingles on the Beat show.